Cúntas a rachtra ó aimseir cogur na saoirse géirí thugatá gceist agus chun ar mar réocht trúirtas na nuglaigh Gortaglanna trócar dé orthu go léir. So, hello and welcome to everyone, and I hope you gain something from tonight's lecture, which looks at one rather tragic aspect of the fight for Irish freedom in North Kerry, and that is how 3 volunteer officers were killed at Gortaglanna, just adjacent to Knockanure, on the 12th of May 1921. And this and some related events are contained in a book that I've just published. It's just out, literally hot off the presses, When Freedom's Sword Was Drawn, as the title I gave it. And this looked at amazing, it's a microcosm of events in North Kerry in a 10-week period within a 10-kilometre area around the Gortaglanna, Kilmorna, Knockanure, Maivan and Kylbuoy areas. And the title I gave that book is called When Freedom's Sword Was Drawn, and it's taken from a line from a poem by a local poet called Tate Gordon that he called The Boys of Sweet Dewa. And Tate wrote many entertaining songs, but he was also caught up in the events of the 1920s, and included is a verse there that you see there. How sad and mournful is the tale that I am going to tell. From Ballyheigue to Abbeyfield will mourn their loss as well. Where are the men who raised the flag and freedom's sword did draw, who trampled down the English flag, or the boys from Sweet Dewa? So, just by way of background, there was a long tradition of resistance to British rule in Ireland, and North Kerry was foremost in that at all stages. And an account of a government spy from the 18th century, I've used it in the book just to kick off one chapter, and it reads as follows. This is from around the 1780s. The Dewa boys, though lashed to take up arms, have this day made a formidable appearance under the command of Captain Smart, Captain Speedwell of Listowel, Farnocht of Lizelton, Washington of Maivan, Steele and Slasher of Tarbert, and the entire subordinate to General Crushall of Ballylongford. And I'm thankful to the late Antaharo Kiosan for digging out that reference. Of those men, just the name of Steele can be identified now after all these years, and he was one of the Langans of the Glen area. So they were the white boys at the end of the 18th century. And I want to dedicate tonight's lecture to two Listowel men, two fellow townsmen of my own that were a big influence on me when I was collecting my stories. The first one was the late Jack Leahy, lover of all things Gaelic, from Church Street himself, and a noted musician and promoter of all things Irish, including the Antanga Gaeilge. And the late lovable Padder, or Bobby McGrath, as we was call him, of Glowna Foca, for whom the memories of men such as Walsh, Lyons and Dalton, and all the men who fought in North Kerry were evergreen in his memory. So anyhow, tonight's lecture, to kind of get straight into it, we're looking at events at the 12th of May, 1921. And this is a map that appears in my book, and it just shows just quite how close all these events happened. I don't think there's any place in the whole country that you had so many incidents in so short a time scale. And these are events that actually impacted on the national narrative of the war for freedom in Ireland. And here we have an image from that time. This is courtesy of the Imperial War Museum in England, and it would be something familiar to generations previous to our own, of military parties engaged in a roundup of the countryside. They're well armed, they have the most modern transport at their disposal at the time, and they're hindered in their work by the demolition of a bridge, in this instance down in Cork. So anyhow, the Irish War of Independence raged from January 1919 to July 1921, and was the culmination of centuries of resistance to British rule in Ireland. And the immediate background was the 1916 Easter Rebellion, and the proclamation of independence day referred to the failed attempts of the previous generations to overthrow foreign rule. And these are references to the uprisings of 1798, that should be 1803. It's amazing how you only spot the errors as you're going through them. 1848 and 1867. And men of North Kerry were to the fore in all of these attempts. We know that a McKenna is buried outside in Kilsyne and took part in the 1798 rebellion. Michael Guerin, who I'm looking at there tonight, has drawn attention to Robert Emmett's connections to North Kerry in his great book there recently. 1848 is commemorated inside in the Pikeman Memorial in Tralee, to which Jerry Lyons, his father, also called Jerry Lyons, was collecting money for its to be unveiled around 1900. And the Fenians of 1867 would have been well known to the men of the 1916-21 time. So the War of Independence came to North Kerry when a policeman named Clark was shot and wounded in Ballylongford. So he was the first victim of the volunteers when they moved from being passive resistance into armed opposition to the British rule. But resistance had been simmering post-Easter 1916. And in July 1917, Denny Scanlon was shot dead in Ballybunion in an event that was coincided with the East Clare by-election, which saw an early victory for the Sinn Féin candidate Eamon de Valera. Around October 1917, there was a major riot in Listowel, and this was well recollected, and the involvement of the one and only Mickey Downey led to a lot of the tour that it was called at that time. And the police drew their batons to clear the street on that occasion. And eventually they resorted to the firing of shots at the crowd. So by 1917, well in advance of the events at Solo Headbeg, our own town of Listowel can take pride of place to show that there was active resistance to British rule. For more on the right in Tralee, John Flaherty's excellent book on Listowel races has a mention of that, because it seemed to have happened coinciding with the races. So moving on to 1920, 1921, and particularly 1920, just in the aftermath of the shooting of Constable Clark in Ballylongford, the government response was to let the police deal with the situation, that they felt that it was something that could be dealt with just by the civil and police authorities. But by 1920, as we know, and Cara, you have covered this with the events of the Listowel Mutiny in June 1921, many of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the Irish police, they were unhappy with the situation they found themselves in, and they resigned. And as a result, emergency reinforcements, since known as Black and Tans, and auxiliaries were drafted in. Now, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, they're two separate bodies. The Black and Tans were really kind of emergency policemen, and the auxiliaries were former officers. So just there was a kind of a class distinction between the two outfits there. Now, additionally, military reinforcements poured into the county, and the late Brian McMahon remembers the Yorkshire Regiment and the East Lancashire Regiment being stationed in Kerry, and the North Lancs had a unit that was based initially in the Cow's Lawn and later at Ballinrudrig Castle, just outside the town on the Woodford side. The Royal Fusiliers were based in Kilmare and in Killarney. And martial law was declared. So as the war developed, martial law was came into being, and meant that the police became more militarized, and they were answerable to military rule and all that went with that. So there was a breakdown of society, really, is what happened. So it was recalled by the older generation as a period of oppression, of terror by those who lived through it, and the common stories were of houses being raided, houses being burned. There was houses burned within the town of Listowel, people being attacked and molested, people being forced to do work against their will. One of the Galvins there in Church Street was marched up to my own birthplace of Caherdown and forced to fill in a trench, and there he died in early 1921. He got a heart attack, very much a victim of the troubled times. So against the British forces of police, TENS, auxiliaries and army, you had an IRA unit. So the IRA stands for the Irish Republican Army, and initially they were set up in companies, and there was a company in Tarbert, in Maivan, in Dual, etc., in all the major villages of North Kerry, and these were grouped together into battalions, with the battalion being answerable to a brigade staff in Tralee, and the brigade staff in Tralee being answerable in turn to a headquarters in Dublin. And this is all fine, but the Irish Republican Army was an army without weaponry. So what we have here is a picture of a unit called the North Kerry column, and the men there involved in this well-known picture, and there front on the left is Paddy Joe Mccalligan, and next to him is Dennis Quill. And of these two men, we'll have more to say as we're going along. This is another photo taken on the same day of the North Kerry column. Martin Quill is on the right there in front. That's who I think it is anyway. I've never got any names for this, and that would strike me as being Dennis Quill at the back there. It's a photo I picked up there some years ago, and I hadn't seen it previously published. Nice one to have. So, as I said, the volunteers organized themselves into companies, and the companies were into battalions. The battalions reported to a brigade in Tralee, and the brigade reported to a headquarters which was linked to an alternative Sinn Féin government structure set up after the 1918 elections. So the IRA looked to their authority and their legitimacy to the 1918 elections, when they secured an overall majority throughout Ireland, and instead of sending the elected representatives to London, they met in Dublin in January 1919 and declared their independence. Now, this is a photo of the man that was in charge of the Listowel battalion in 1921. His name was Paddy Joe Mccalligan. He was from Convent Street in Listowel, and he succeeded his brother Michael, who was killed behind in Derrymore in Tralee while attending a brigade meeting. And the Mccalligans were very active and very much the forefront in the leadership of the IRA in Listowel. In fact, Paddy Joe, as a very young man, joined the IRB while still a student in St. Michael's College. That's recorded in Gahan's book about Listowel. And he was wounded on the day of the Mickey Downey riot in Listowel of October 1917. Now, it was fine to have an army with plenty of men and companies, which sounded great, and battalions and brigades and everything else like that. But what armaments they did, what they did is they formed an active service unit. So if we go back to that picture, those pictures just show the active service units, right? And what they looked like. And this is a flying column, and they control the armaments of the IRA, and they could serve in a full-time mobile capacity. So their response to the British was to just move around the countryside and hold attacks, right? They were led by Dennis Quill of Listowel, and the Quills were also very much the forefront in the fight for Irish freedom. Dennis and his brother Martin, who subsequently served in Donegal during the Civil War and who immigrated to America. And some of the attacks led by these units saw the killing of the District Inspector Tobias O'Sullivan in Listowel in January 1921. And a month later, at an attack in Ballylongford, 2 of the Crown forces were killed that led to serious reprisals where much of that town was burned. This is a picture of Dennis Quill, who led the active service unit in 1921 in North Kerry. So that's the immediate background to events at Gortaglanna on the 12th of May 1921. Just to summarise, there had been a simmering resistance to British rule. there had been the killing of the district inspector, which was a high-profile killing by the IRA. There had been the formation of the flying column, and then we come to Gortaglanna in May 1921. And in the week beforehand, the column was stationed at Coolard, okay, on the Ballybonan and Ballydonoghue side. The column was disbanded, and there's various reasons advanced. And we've got to understand that there is no simple and single narrative as to what exactly happened here. And different people will have their own views. And I, as a historian, can only put forward what is in the record. And so some of the reasons why the column was disbanded, Paddy Joe says because the area was swarming with Crown forces. Dennis Quill suggests that it was because there was an outbreak of scabies that led to them taking medical advice to disband it. And another reason advanced is they were actually stood down by the brigade staff in Tralee. At any rate, they broke up into small groups and two men went to Athea. That was Condé and Paddy Dalton. Paddy Dalton was an Athea man himself, where his brother was the company captain in Athea. So it made sense for them to cross the border over to Athea. As it happens, there was a mission being held there, and a mission, some of the listeners may not be familiar with a mission, but I think most of us will be. It was a religious refreshing, might be the best way to put it, held by the Redemptorist Order. And there was a suggestion that some intelligence had been passed to the Crown forces to say that it might be worth their while to raid the mission at Athea. So Dee and Dalton went over to Athea. They followed the River Gale across, taking precautions to avoid the main roads, and they warned the West Limerick crowd. They went over there on a Monday. On Wednesday, they were joined by Paddy Walsh. Now, on Thursday, they decided to return to North Kerry to rejoin the column. The column was being reformed again to go back in. So presumably by this stage, for whatever reason they disbanded, that was resolved and they were ready to go back into the fray again. And as it happens, they travelled in from Athea, and the Athea road brings you along, the Athea road into Listowel brings you along by a place called Gortaglanna. Now, the night before, there was a battalion council meeting held in Mayor Hearn's house in Coolard. And Mayor Hearn's house would be very close to where St. Bat's Well is now, just along the road where Gale's cemetery is. It's a bit off the road. It's a nice, secure location. And at that battalion council meeting, it's a very important and key aspect of the Gortaglanna story. Christy Brody of the War and Jerry Lyons of the War reported back on an earlier meeting held in Tralee. And there would have been a lot of items discussed at that, but just to keep us kind of concise here tonight, it was proposed to have a general attack throughout Munster on the Crown forces that weekend on the 14th of May. So there's no doubt that the reason that the column was reassembling was to participate in this Munster-wide campaign. And you can get references to that in Tom Barry's book, Guerrilla Days in Ireland. Now, on the Thursday morning, as the three boys were returning from Athea, passing through Gortaglanna and Knockanure, the two lads were coming on from Coolard, and they were also approaching Knockanure on their way back to Dual, to their home place. As it happens, Christy Brody, we call him Christy Brody, his proper name is Christopher Broderick, of course, had cousins in Gortaglanna, and he diverted down to visit those. Last minute decision saved his life. Some other accounts say that the chain his bike broke, or that he had trouble with his bike or something like that. But at any rate, Christopher Brody went to Gortaglanna. So that left Lyons to continue on, and at the bridge near Denny McMahon's house, they met in the morning of the Thursday, the 12th of May. And this is a lovely photograph that has survived from that time, and it was taken in Walsh's of Gunsborough. And at the back on the right is Paddy Walsh. Next to him, on his right is Molly Kenny, who died in the 1940s. She was from Listowel. She was a sister of John Joe Kenny. And next to her is Mrs. Walsh, a stepmother of Paddy Walsh. She was Julia Kazan. And on the extreme left, as I'm looking at it here, is Bill Walsh. In the front, from the left, is Jerry Lyons. And next to him is Condé. That's Condé that's kind of standing out there. And next to him is Paddy Dalton. Now, the reason that Condé is kind of looks a bit awkward there in that photo, I think, is because there was 2 photos taken that day. And I suspect that Condé had taken the first photograph. And as he just came back in then to be included in the second photograph, he's a small bit out of place, as often happens when that happens. But that's just a supposition by me, because someone else might come back and advance an equally plausible explanation. So this is the second photograph, and you have the same people, but now you have Paddy Walsh's father in the background. Again, you have Molly Kenny, you have the 3 boys, and this is the photo I suspect was taken by Dee. And the man on the extreme left in the front is a great hero of the flying column of North Kerry, his Johnny Lennon of Glura. And he was killed himself tragically 2 years later in 1923, April 1923, in the war. And again, I think he's sitting a bit awkward there, and I suspect that he took the other photograph with D in it. So the 4 boys were now at near McMahon's, at the bridge of McMahon's in Gortaglanna. This is on the road to Athea. There's a little plaque on the road sense. If anyone is looking for it now, it's about 5 kilometers on the Kerry side of Athea. And they were captured by a mobile patrol of 3 lorries of police in black and tans. Okay, so 3 lorries came up from the Listowel side, up from Shannacool, up along the hill, and the lads were in a valley, so they couldn't see the lorries, and they were on them before they got a chance to escape. They had jumped the field to head up towards Leahy's through a farmer called Bambury's lands when there were shots fired at them, and they surrendered and came in. According to Dee's statement, they were subject to a hammering. They were beaten with rifles and given a very hard time. And he mentions that there was blood flowing from the noses of all the victims. They were put into the lorries, and they were brought initially towards Athea, but eventually back towards the site of the monument on what's now known as Gortaglanna. You'll all be familiar with that. There they were lined up and they were shot. When they were shot, Condé literally ran for his life, and although he was wounded in the leg, he succeeded in escaping from them. And this is a photo of Paddy Dalton. It's suspected that the man there on the left is a high-ranking officer from West Limerick, but I haven't been able to confirm that yet. But I think it's a lovely photograph of Paddy Dalton. Paddy Dalton, by the way, was a very popular man in Listowel. He worked in Feely's in William Street. He was the treasurer of the GEA in the town, right? And he was very well liked and likable sort of a man. This is a photo of Jerry Lyons of Dwall. And Lyons is typical of the members of the column. He's actually from a very well-to-do family. His father was a very progressive and successful businessman. He had a pub, and he had a contracting business, and he had a shop. And there was 2 boys in the family, Ger and John. John went on to become a clerical student, and Lyons Senior had sufficient resources and money back in around 1916 to send him to St. Brendan's Seminary in Killarney. And as I understand it from a man that knew Jerry Lyons, that was the late Father Mundy Stack, that Jerry Lyons himself was educated in University College Dublin. I did contact University College Dublin, but with the COVID restrictions, I couldn't get any further with that, but I will pursue that to try and get a copy of when he exactly attended UCD. This is a photograph of Paddy Walsh, and if people will just bear with me while I kind of divert a small bit just to tell a small story about this particular mortuary card. I have the origin of this mortuary card, and indeed the Walsh's families and the Dowling families have their own copies of it as well. But this one turned up in a cookbook in London, and a woman of Irish extraction bought the cookbook, and she made contact with people in North Kerry to see would anyone know anything about Paddy Walsh, and eventually it found its way to me. And I have sent a copy of my book over to Tina Kelly. She's a woman with Meath connections, and she was delighted to learn that the mortuary card of Paddy Walsh that she found in a cookbook over in London has been returned to North Kerry and is preserved. Paddy Walsh was a dedicated member of the volunteers, right? Dedicated member of the volunteers. And in fact, you can see a bit of his, where he gets his republicanism from, because his father was very involved in the land wars of the previous generation, when there was this much dispute with the landlords over the paying of rents and trying to wrest the control of the lands from the land agents and the landlord class into the possession of the people themselves. And this is an account from 1919, and it reads, you can all read it, a young man named Patrick Welsh of Knockanock has been arrested and charged before Jones, the resident magistrate at Listowel Barracks, with illegal drilling. The accused refused to recognise the court, was remanded to the next sessions of Listowel court. Now he got sentenced, and he got a further sentence on top of the initial sentence for failing to recognise the court. While he was in court, while he was in Limerick jail, he met other activists, and this would have further militised Paddy Walsh. But the Sinn Féin members of the volunteers did all the farm work for him in his absence. This is a copy of a letter that was given to me by the late Patsy Walsh of the Ballybunion Road Listowel, and Patsy was a nephew of Paddy Walsh, and he was intensely proud of his uncle. And the writing in the top right reads Cosca Magaul Limnach, and I think from here my eyesight has fallen me at Lunasa, that means August. And to the left of that, the prison censor put in the best King's English of the time, His Majesty's Prison, Limerick, the 28th of August, 1919. And this letter is written to his friend Micheál, and we can see in the middle of it, there's a bit blanked out because whatever Paddy wrote wasn't it didn't agree with whatever the censor deemed to be appropriate. But whoever he wrote to was someone that had just been released from the prison. And the Walsh family still have this letter, and indeed they have many other memories and mementos of Paddy Walsh. This is a little card I picked up myself in Dublin. It came from my wife's aunt of all people. And over on the right, third last there is Pádraig Breathnach, and that's Paddy Walsh. And this is a card that refers to members of Cumann na Fáinne. And it shows that Paddy Walsh was a dedicated proponent of the Irish language, and he had a love for the Gaeilge. And it's nice to see that underneath his name, there are two more Kerrymen. Immediately under him is Sean O'Loughlin, right? And that's young John Lawler of Glenna, a clerical student who was beaten to death in the streets of Listowel around New Year's Day in 1921. And the name below him was Joseph Talura, or Joe Taylor, who was killed around the same time as the Gortaglanna martyrs. They're all remembered here in this memorial card. This is another nice photograph that was given to me by Tim Horgan, but it's also held by the Dowling family of Coolard. And in the centre, we have Paddy Walsh, and nicely with him, on his right, or on the left as you're facing him, is Jim Shukru, and on his right is Johnny Lennon. And I think it's a lovely photograph, and it just shows the bond of friendship of the active servicemen. All of these were on the North Kerry column, and this photograph was also taken at Paddy Walsh's house in Knockanock, Gunsborough or Coolard. This is a photo I picked up from the National Library, and in the National Library it's not catalogued correctly at all, so someone else that is going looking for it will have trouble finding it, and I must get onto the National Library and tell them to recorrect it, because there's quite a number of photographs in the same collection that all relate to Listowel, and they won't be found. I only found them by accident. And this is an example of the military lorries at the time. And this photograph is taken outside the barracks in Listowel. And I want you to just take note of Shukru's house in the background. That's the house next to the barracks at the time. And the house is still there. I forget what, I can't recall now what it's called now. It was Keen's in my time in Listowel. And we can see the dress of the woman in the background. So I want you to just remember Shukru there in that house. Get back to Gortaglanna. We picture two men here. We have Condé and we have Donald Bill Sullivan. So Condé, he's every inch of a soldier, military bearing about him in this photograph. It was taken around 1961 when he had returned on one of his visits from America. And I'll return to the story of Donald Bill in a minute, but just to get a picture of Condé there for you. So Dee was a former soldier. He had military training. He served in the Irish Guards and he was on the Western Front during the First World War. His nephew told me that he was wounded in the thumb and he got returned on leave and he acted as a training officer to the IRA. So this wouldn't be unusual at all. And the most common instance of this would be Tom Barry of West Cork, who also returned to take up the fight for Irish freedom. And these were badly needed by the IRA because a trained man would bring a lot of knowledge and help and guidance and confidence to members of the IRA. Dee took part in the Ballylongford attack, and it's important to stress that he was a first cousin of Paddy Walsh, both the mothers being keen girls of Slieve Cahill and Listowel. Dee went on himself to serve during the Civil War, and he took the anti-government side or the Republican side. And this is, I picked this up from one of these autograph books that were held in jail, at which stage he was in Hare Park camp in the Curragh. And this meant that he had given dedicated service to the fight for Irish freedom, because he became one of the last men to be released from prison in 1923. Going back to Gortaglanna, the Tans lined up to shoot the four men. Four men, according to Dee, were selected to shoot them, and with the rest behind him. The man that delegated to shoot him delayed or dropped his rifle by a different account, and the others opened fire. He ran. This gave him an opportunity to escape, because the main party then couldn't fire at him because the firing party were in the way. So from Gortaglanna, he got down through Shannacool, Buniara, and on to Kylbuie. At Kylbuie, he was utterly exhausted. It was quite a hot day, and there was two men called Carmody, his father and son, and they were going to the bog. And they met the wounded man, and they had a horse's cart, and they put the wounded man into the cart, and they brought him over to the Kylbuie Road. This would be the road on which the Jack Sheehan Memorial now is. And not too far down that road, he was moved into a now demolished Ringfort on the lands of a Michael McCarthy. And Michael McCarthy's son, Ned McCarthy, who I remember myself, who was a member of the junior wing of the IRA called the Fianna Éireann, was sent to Donald Bill Sullivan to notify him that there was a wounded man there that needed rescuing. So Donald Bill went down, collected the man, and he brought him to Enrights of Ballahadai. In the meantime, his sister Hans Sullivan, a captain of Commemoration, was sent into Listowel to Dr. James Ignatius Enright, who willingly attended and came out to meet the wounded man and dressed his wound and sorted him out. And that night he was moved again further away, because there was extensive searches by the Crown forces for the wounded man. They knew that one man had gone away. And I'd like to pay a special tribute to the two Enright families that are so central to this story. The Enrights of Ballahadai, who sheltered the man at great risk to themselves. That was the house of Jack Enright. and to James Ignatius Enright. I would also draw the listeners' attention to the fact that I presume it's still there, but for many years there was a plaque to James Ignatius Enright in the front pew of Listowel Church. It was built into the pew. Initially it used to be on the right, but the last time I saw it, it was on the left-hand side. That is Donald Bill that brought the wounded D initially to Enright's of Ballyhadaig, and later he brought him to Ballylongford. And this is Hans Sullivan, the captain of Commemoration, who came into town to get Dr. Enright and to direct him to Enright's of Ballyhadaig. And this then is Dr. James Ignatius Enright, a loyal patriot that attended attended medically to the wounded D. His brother had been killed in Salonika during the First World War. He had served during the First World War himself and was familiar with the treatment of gunshot wounds. So now at this stage, we have D down in Enright's of Ballyhadaig, and we have 3 murdered patriots lying at Gortaglanna. So in the immediate aftermath, the bodies were brought to Tralee initially before being brought out to Listowel for burial. And a man named Milan brought Dalton's body to Listowel, to Athea from Listowel. And this is a photo given to me by a relative of Paddy Dalton called James Kelly. He was very helpful to me, of the funeral of Paddy Dalton to Athea. This photograph, I think, is a rather beautiful photograph, and it again has never been published before, and it's the funeral of Jerry Lyons going through the war. And I'm ever grateful to the late Dr. Robert Cordon for giving me this photograph and a number of other photographs that were taken at Lyons's funeral and have never been published at all. So here we see the tricolour covered coffin being carried through the war for burial in Springmount. Okay, and underneath it, underneath the coffin, you can make out Jerry Lyons' mother and father. They're there in that. The central woman here in this photograph, another photograph from Springmount Cemetery, and we can see the sadness of the family of Jerry Lyons at the funeral. And if you like, his mother there in the middle is a very proud-looking mother there. But we see the girl neck on her left now looking very sad. And over to to Mrs. Lyons's right is Mrs. Keane who was later Mrs. Keane of Listowel. So the Keanes of Listowel, the Scullys, the Cordons were all related to Jerry Lyons, and all of them are intensely proud of their connection to this patriot. Another photograph from Springmount, and this is the clergy reading the Office of the Dead at Springmount. This is a photograph that I didn't include in my book because it's a bit blurred, but again, it just captures another scene at the funeral of Jerry Lyons. I think that these are priceless and very important photographs. And again, I'll mention again that Dr. Cordon of Listowel that gave me these photographs. I mentioned a young man called Christy Brody that came from the meeting in Coolard. He had attended an earlier meeting in Tralee. And Christy Brody was a bosom friend of Jerry Lyons's. And this is a photograph that I got from Mrs. Gunn in Dewar a long time ago. And I think it's a lovely photograph of the times. And Christy was quite a tragic young man, and again shows the suffering and endurance that all these volunteers had to put up in the fight for Irish freedom. And that he served during the Civil War in Donegal, and his health broke down and he died young in 1925, and he is now buried side by side with Jerry Lyons in Springmount Cemetery in Dewar, another member of the North Kerry column from that time. Rather unusual as our story emerges in my digging into Gortaglanna, and that's the story of Jack Shine of Athea. Sometimes we think that this is a story about North Kerry, but we've got to remember too that it is equally a West Limerick story. And there was a raid in Athea that day, and Jack Shine was arrested by a party of military, and he was found in possession of a gun. and he ended up being sentenced. And because it was during martial law, he faced a death sentence. But because the truce came in within a number of weeks, he fortunately was saved. And as I understand it, Jack Shine went to America. He was released from prison around December 1921. Now, since then, every year there have been commemorations in Gortaglanna, and latterly this was done at the behest of the North Kerry Republican Soldiers Committee, and we must acknowledge their work in putting up fine memorials to all the patriot dead of North Kerry. They were really to the forefront of this, that they're really the memorials that have gone up to, especially at Gortaglanna, are a tribute, and I mean, they really showed that their sacrifice would be remembered forevermore. And this photograph, I drew your attention earlier on to a photograph of Shukroos, and again, this photo is taken in Listowel with Shukroos in the background. So in other words, we were just outside the barracks in Listowel. Photographer is taking this from what is now, we'll say, somewhere around Tarns. And what you have is a military parade passing up through Church Street. And I just love the children in the front. But there's the Listowel Brass Band, there's the volunteers, and with the rifles reversed, they're marching out. And I believe that this photograph was taken at the first anniversary of the Gortaglanna killings in May 1922. This photograph was kindly supplied to me by the late Mairead Scanlon of Clarnbridge, Mairead O'Callaghan of Knockanure, formerly. It's another rather beautiful photo that I've included in my book, and it is of the first anniversary commemoration in Gortaglanna. And if you look closer, you'll see the crosses are in the front, the Listowel band are there again, and rather unusually, they have flags there, and I don't really associate Republican meetings from the 20s with flags. And I'd love to know what the flags were of, because I just don't know. But there's the volunteers in their typical dress. The man in the foreground who's given the oration is in uniform, with the rest with bandoliers there in the background. The quality of the photographs here for the presentation tonight, I just took them out of the book, so they mightn't be the best quality, but you get the idea. This is another photograph that I picked up, and this came from the Quill family of Listowel, and it shows an area party going out. It could just as easily be a column on the move, but I believe it's the advance party for the first anniversary commemoration. This is the cross in Gortaglanna, and typically these crosses contain a number of, they could be a subject of a discussion in their own right, and we note that the religious overtones, the cross rifles, the reference to 1916, and the further date left rather like Emmett's tomb uninscribed. These are photographs I got from the late Billy Connolly of Cooltousan, who was a long-time resident in Chicago, with his uncle Jim Shanahan, who was the last member of the Bedford Company, and they're of Condee's funeral, and including a firing party from his old comrades. So he was well remembered right up to his death as being sympathetic to the cause for Irish freedom. I better finish up now, because I don't know how long this has gone on, but time seems to fly from this side. I don't know what it feels like from your side. And it's just a conclusion. What does Gortaglanna mean for 100 years on? And everyone will have their own answer to this, and I can only give my answer. So personally, I think that it was an important event in the Irish War of Independence that shows that the youth of 100 years ago took on the responsibility of establishing a better and fairer society based on the ideals of the 1916 proclamation. And I would really want to emphasize that the young people of the 20s, these were men in their 20s that took on this role themselves. And I think for me, there's an intense pride. God, the accountant is coming in and me, I see price there, that we remember their sacrifice and their ideals. And I do think that that is the most important thing for me, that these men sacrificed for an ideal and that they succeeded in achieving. I can't really say any more than that other than Benachta Loho Galea. I hope you enjoy that. If anyone has any questions,